What a crazy last 7 months we've been living. A pandemic caused by the invisible coronavirus and civil unrest caused by an old foe we've been fighting since before America was founded as a nation. Now, America is as polarized as it's ever been before, with elections approaching us in November. So let's talk about it. Welcome to my Black Lives Matter documentary, film, whatever you want to call it. In this video, I go over what the movement is really about and what it's trying to achieve. I go over American history to explain why this movement happened in the first place. I also go over protests, riots, looting, and explain the differences between them. And finally, I talk about what we need to change and what we need to do to make that change. To begin this video, let's start off with what a peaceful protest looks like in my hometown, Las Cruces, New Mexico.
People try and act like they don't, but I appreciate every single one of you out here. Because whether you're black, brown, white, you know that injustice at my house is injustice for yours.
Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Until you agree that we are not dangerous because of the color of our skin.
What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and they're carrying signs. Mostly say hooray for our side. It's time to stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
What do we want?
Justice.
What do we want?
Justice. Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor.
Black Lives Matter.
Paranoia strikes deep.
There is no difference in between George
Into
Floyd
your life it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the man come and take you away. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop now. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop. Children, what's that sound?
Mourners gathered in Houston today to remember the life of the man whose death has sparked worldwide outrage.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! Black Lives Matter!
Sydney, Japan, South Korea, Kenya, South Africa, Lebanon, Canada, all of these just in the past 48 hours. Everywhere there is hope, the swell of support will amount to change, finally.
That is the group now marching over the Brooklyn Bridge towards Manhattan. They're on the Manhattan-bound roadway.
These are just a few of the many victims who have lost their lives due to the color of their skin in the US. Each and every one of these deaths is a tragedy worthy of nationwide protests, but the death of George Floyd was the match that lit the powder keg. The murder by police that communities finally responded with, enough is enough. We must realize there is no solution when we don't talk to each other. No change is made. We are a polarized nation. Everybody is yelling, please listen. The Black Lives Matter movement is a movement asserting human rights that were traditionally denied to African Americans. One of the main controversies surrounding this movement is in its name. The Black Lives Matter movement is not meant to claim that only they matter, but traditionally they have not mattered. Once you understand the history of this country's social and political injustice, the Black Lives Matter movement makes perfect and necessary sense. For some people, all lives matter is a natural response to the Black Lives Matter movement, but that obscures the context and history of this movement as a response to historical inequalities. Throughout American history, Black lives have been judged as less than equal, opposite of what is stated in the Declaration of Independence. People who claim all lives matter might want to consider America's historical inequalities and the legacy of slavery. Black Lives Matter is a call for recognition of American history. This movement has pushed the fundamental problem of unequal application of the law, unequal application of political and social rights into the light for us all. This movement is fighting for rights that have been denied to people of color, rights that George Floyd was denied on the day he was murdered. Black Lives Matter is a fight for equality. We're fighting for police reform, not destruction. We want accountability within law enforcement and better training for officers. So when a movement like this comes along, to address and confront historical racial injustice and to hold our law enforcers accountable, stand behind it, giving it momentum, power, and possibility to make a change. I believe the only way to beat racism is through education and awareness. So let's start at the very beginning, with the specific history that has led to the social uprising we are experiencing now, the history of oppression and slavery that built the so-called land of the free. It all started when Western European colonizers bartered, bought, and packed peoples from the African continents into slave ships and sent them to all corners of the New World. In the 13 colonies, this labor force built the foundation for a rapidly growing American agricultural economy. Southern states would soon come to rely entirely upon this source of free labor to keep their economy growing at the amazing pace at which it grew. It was not only slavery that helped build the country we now live in, but the land itself was stolen from the native inhabitants of America. The justification for this was coined in 1845 as manifest destiny, a widely held cultural belief used by American imperialists to justify this barbaric cruelty. As colonization continued west, more and more Native American peoples were forcibly removed from their homelands to areas of the country not suited for settling, and their lands were repurposed for more plantation crops, which meant more slave labor to work the fields. When political representation in Congress was discussed in 1787, Southern and Northern delegates reached a compromise where each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a man. Keep in mind, however, these are the very same delegates who created a government that specifically states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," and then detains, interns, enslaves, and murders its own people of color by the authority of the state for most of its history, that government has become the very thing the 13 original colonies fought to separate from. Although the ideas and documents that structure the laws of this nation are some of the greatest political theories ever created, our implementation of the Constitution's framework into law and practice, especially concerning race and sex equality, was flawed. It was a human rights disaster, and the implications of these racial disparities we are now feeling today. Many people make the argument that racism ended long ago and that people of color have the exact same opportunities that whites do today, but that's not true. Racism embedded itself into the very fabric of American society over many generations and will take many more generations to work itself out. How can we possibly expect something so insidious that was with us for more than 400 years on this continent to clear out in just decades? Legally, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but during Reconstruction, Southern politicians began a campaign to intimidate Black people to suppress their voting. Extensive voter fraud was also used, and Southern politicians gradually regained power. These Southern attitudes and legal practices created the system of Jim Crow. When Jim Crow was finally dealt with during the Civil Rights Movement of 1965, the oppression of African Americans and the attempts to keep them enslaved was reconstructed into a practice that polite white society could ignore: the overwhelming rate at which African Americans are incarcerated in America. This is modern-day slavery. This is racism redesigned. Are you questioning those statements? Do you want proof? Because I have plenty. So let's get into it. Slavery was abolished in 1865 when the 13th Amendment was adopted. It reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." This punishment for crime was a loophole used by white society to once again lock up African Americans and return them to a condition all too similar to slavery. In response to the 13th Amendment, according to the Equal Justice Initiative, Southern state legislatures passed Black Codes, which were new laws that explicitly applied only to Black people and subjugated them to criminal prosecution for minor offenses like loitering, breaking curfew, and not carrying proof of employment. These new laws were crafted to turn African Americans back into slaves, and it worked. For the first time in US history, many state penal systems held more Black prisoners than white, when Blacks made up only 14% of the population. And each of these convicts could be leased for profit. Prisoners were sent to private railways, mines, and even large plantations. While states profited off of the imprisoned, these African Americans earned no pay, faced inhumane, dangerous, and often deadly work conditions. This convict leasing was the start of mass incarceration. A bias was thus created to associate Black people as violent, dangerous, and out of control so they could more easily be incarcerated. A widely popular film made in 1915, The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, portrays African Americans as white society saw them, animalistic rapists. This film rebirthed the KKK, and soon in real life, mobs lynched and killed African Americans because they were believed to be lesser human beings that were dangerous and criminal. Soon, this open violence wasn't as widely accepted, so it morphed into Jim Crow laws and segregation, continuing this generational trauma. 1950s civil rights activists stood up and fought for their rights. They were seen as deliberately violating the law to protest, which is some of what we see today. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. Equal justice becomes a possibility. That word is key. Possibility. Because once again, racism didn't just go away. As the population of the US rises because of the baby boomers, crime also rises. The civil rights movement was happening simultaneous to this population and crime increase, so the politicians blamed the movement as contributing to this crime. They justified that the more individual freedom these people got, the more crimes they would commit. Once again, the bias of seeing African Americans or people of color as violent, crime-committing human beings continued, and the seed of mass incarceration was now planted. In Nixon and Reagan's presidencies, law and order and war on crime were major political incentives that purposely targeted and disproportionately convicted and imprisoned groups of poor minorities. The war on drugs criminalized drug abuse and economic inequality, targeting Black, Hispanic, and Native American communities alike, enabling the mass incarceration of minorities across America. Once again, racism hasn't gone away, it's just gotten smarter, disguising itself in politics. In both Nixon and Reagan's presidencies, each admitted to this wrongdoing. Nixon's advisor John Ehrlichman states, "We had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. Since we can't do anything about them, we got the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Black people with heroin, then criminalize both." And Reagan's campaign strategist Lee Atwater explains that they purposely passed economic initiatives where the byproduct was Blacks getting hurt more than whites. In each of their presidencies, they were able to disrupt targeted communities and groups, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, and vilify them on the news. Soon, it was 1985, and this war on drugs was now pop culture, normalized in TV shows like Cops, and in the media where they overrepresented Black people as criminals. At this point, we are decades into America thinking people of color, particularly African Americans, are criminals. Crime then becomes a major focal voting point. Every candidate was already harsh on crime, so to win you had to go even further. Bill Clinton scored cheap political points from a broken industry and passed policies that were even harsher on crime. Laws that went even further on a system that was already built to discriminate against a group of minorities. He introduced bills like the 3 strikes and you're outlaw, where on your third violent crime, you're put away for good. This once again increased the disparity of minorities going to prison because they're already disproportionately approached by the police, resulting in longer records, meaning people of color were being sent away much, much faster. African Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of whites, even 10 times in 10 states. And for cannabis users in 2020, African Americans are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested than whites, when the drug use rate is the same between them. And finally, the fertilizer to the seed of mass incarceration came in the 1984 federal crime bill. This bill put $30 billion into law enforcement and incarcerations, $30 billion into a system that already disproportionately targeted people of color. This massively expanded the already broken prison system. 1 in 4 prisoners in the entire world is incarcerated in the United States. The land of the free was no longer free. Once again, these politicians tend to admit their wrongdoing. Clinton admits his bill was a mistake and that it made mass incarceration worse. Other than eating up people of color, our criminal justice system dehumanizes and numbs the imprisoned. Our system has too many laws that unfairly lock people up for too many offenses, giving sentences that are too harsh, putting people in prison where there is little to no rehabilitation effort. And when they get out, their ability to get jobs, student loans, business license, food stamps, and life insurance are hindered. Poverty is a product and outcome of incarceration. Now let me say that again. Poverty is a product and outcome of incarceration. They lose the right to vote. Their citizenship is stripped from them. It sure sounds like Jim Crow is legal once you've been branded a felon. This is the redesigned racism I was talking about. This is modern day slavery. The 13th Amendment's dangerous loophole to this day still permits the enslavement of prisoners who continue to work without pay in various public and private industries. Now, if you need a recap on the history of how systemic racism began to control our systems, I'm gonna put up these charts. Pause the video, go over the information, analyze the steps that were taken, but remember, we got here on purpose. This system was built to purposely target certain groups of people, and this police violence reflects this. It shows a much larger, brutal, and broken system of racial and social control.
If we can't die in behalf of progress, we can live for it. The way our fighting brothers and sisters looked at it, we're lucky. And they're right, we're lucky to be alive, but only if our lives make life itself worth dying for. Unless we put the gift of life to the hard employments of justice. If we waste that gift, we won't have anywhere to hide from the indignation of history. The morality of the auction block is out of date. There is no room in the American century for Jim Crow. I come in that boy's name and in the name of all who in this land of ours have no voice of their own. I come with a call for action. This is a time for it.
It shouldn't matter where you stand politically or culturally to realize that state power is so highly concentrated that it actively suppresses people's right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Power is so consolidated that officers of the law don't face consequences for misusing that power. There is no accountability for law enforcement, and that is what this movement is fighting for. Unrest in the past, like the 1968 Kerner Commission report, calls for this police demilitarization and reinstatement, which is exactly what the movement is asking for now. 52 years ago, it was the same analysis, the same recommendations, but no action came. One of the main points of this movement today is similar to the past, defunding the police. Now, before you leap to conclusions about the wording, hear me out. This is a good idea, but a bad slogan. Defunding the police isn't about dismantling law enforcement, but rather a redistribution of its funds. Black Lives Matter protesters are not terrorists. They're not trying to get rid of the police entirely, causing war and chaos. It's about reallocating some of the billions of dollars that gets put into law enforcement back into our communities. I believe a reallocation of even a small amount of their massive budget will help take a load off their backs. Police officers are overworked. They have so many jobs other than just enforcing the law. People call 911 to get their cats out of trees and to solve civil disputes. The idea of defunding the police is to reallocate some of their budget to other organizations that could do a lot more of the work police departments are burdened with. Instead of putting billions and billions of dollars into law enforcement, start putting some of it into social services, mental health, drug addiction, and even community-based programs of safety, support, and prevention. In New York City, the NYPD budget is $6 billion. In their annual budget cuts, the city cut the police department by 0.39%. This is a tiny sliver when compared to the Department of Youth and Community Development, which funds after school programs, literary services, and even summer youth work programs. They're losing 32% of their budget. This budget of $6 billion in the New York City Police Department is currently more than the NYC's Department of Health, Department of Homeless Services, Department of Youth Services, and Department of Employment Services combined. Police departments get much more money when compared to other departments, and most of these departments' jobs help reduce the police workload. But because these departments are getting more and more money cut out of their budget, their workload is now the police's job to handle. Reallocating the police budget will make it so that police officers do more of the kinds of things they were trained for, which exposes and tackles the root of the problem. Making police officers less overworked give police officers less necessity and opportunity to use force. Jocko Willink, a retired Navy SEAL, explains this lack of police training in a Joe Rogan podcast.
And the way the police departments are set up, they do the most ridiculously minuscule amount of training for what their job is. So, as you know, I was in the SEAL teams. We would train for 18 months. 18 months we would train to go on a 6-month deployment. Cops, they get like 2 hours or 4 hours of combatives training a year. A year. That's complete insanity. It's complete insanity. Cops should train 1/5 of the time. 1/5 of the time you should be training, whether it's 2 hours a day, 4 times a week, or whether it's 1 day a week where you're going to go and you're going to go through scenarios. You're going to do combatives. You're going to work with simunition. You're going to do de-escalation drills.
Police officers aren't trained or equipped to handle so many of the situations they deal with, but don't be mad at them. Be mad at the system that in so many cases puts cops in situations where they're the only public resource within a community. A sociologist, Alex Vitale, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, explains in an interview with The Atlantic that policing is a tool of violence that has historically been used to facilitate gross inequalities and systems of exploitation. And so then to say that that tool is best suited to solve a broad range of community problems is misguided. The initial point of contact with the police is the beginning of our broken criminal justice system. Sure, police are unlikely alone to result in a conviction that leads to a prison sentence, but the presence of a criminal record itself is associated with the decisions to incarcerate for subsequent offenses. People of color are more likely to have a prior record, not because they are more likely to commit crime, but because of more engagement with law enforcement. But where do we even start to take any action? There are many obstacles to making any significant change. Police unions can stop mayors and police chiefs in their tracks for trying to implement anything new into a department. For example, Cleveland police were required to file a report for any time an officer unholstered and pointed his gun at someone. Union head Steve Loomis said it would make police officers scared to pull their guns because of the paperwork. Unions make it almost impossible to discipline officers for even minor mistakes. They also allow officers that have been fired to reapply and get their jobs back with a union contract. The federal government can bypass unions by calling for an investigation of the police department for a pattern of civil rights violations. This is called a consent decree. It requires institutional changes of a department that is overseen by the federal court. But when the government doesn't take any action, people can sue. In fact, there is about $1 billion that goes into misconduct civil suits against cops in a year, but they're usually impossible to win because cops often call on qualified immunity. This means officers could be immune from lawsuits unless their exact conduct has been ruled unconstitutional. It requires victims to identify earlier decision by the Supreme Court or federal court where the exact same conduct under the exact same circumstances is either illegal or unconstitutional. If there are none, the officer gets away with it. In the 1967 case of Pearson versus Ray, the Supreme Court introduced this qualified immunity. They promised it would not provide a license to lawless conduct, but it has. Police shouldn't have a way out of their crime. They shouldn't go to work knowing that if they overreact in a situation, nothing will happen to them, and that they won't be held accountable. Police should only use lethal force when they are in imminent danger. Not, they were reaching for something, not, I think they had a gun. You must be able to handle your fear. You cannot panic, and you cannot be biased. A cop's job isn't to be judge, jury, and executioner. Resisting arrest isn't grounds for murder. The disarray of the American police system stems from a lack of training and the powers and privileges they get with a badge. From there comes the brutality we see today. But in a majority of situations, police officers handle confrontations responsibly. That should in no way justify cases where police officers have misused and abused the law, and it's in those situations where the historical inequalities come into play.
There are laws against peddling dope. There can be laws against peddling race hate. But race hate is not an opinion, it's a phobia. It isn't a viewpoint. Race hate is a disease. In a people's world, the incurable racist has no rights. He must be deprived of influence in a people's government.
In the past couple months, there have been examples of peaceful protests, riots, and then looting. Peaceful protests continue and continue, but they eventually go on deaf ears. The only thing protesters can then do is force the public to pay attention, taking to the streets, blocking roads, even tearing down statues symbolizing racism. Riots in many cases start because of the riot police. When they escalate force, it leads to more violence, not less. It tends to create feedback loops where protesters escalate against police escalate even further, and then both sides become increasingly angry and reactionary. This makes no sense. Mike O'Mara, the police union president, defends these officers. He claims they're being villainized and treated like animals and thugs, but isn't this the same way African Americans have been treated for the last 150 years? Ironic, isn't it?
Because you know what? Everybody's trying to shame us. Yo, hey! Hey! The legislators.
Oh my God.
The press.
We've also seen tear gas being used. Here we go, they're moving through again. This is exactly what it looks like. Exactly what it looks like. We're just standing safely.
Oh. Whoa.
Everybody's trying to shame us into being embarrassed about our profession.
Whoa! Fuck y'all!
This isn't stained. It's still got a shine on it. Stop treating us like animals and thugs. And start treating us with some respect. We've been left out of the conversation. You're not doing anything, you. We've been vilified. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. And that's all I have to say.
There are hundreds of videos like the ones I'm showing you now, but let's break down some of the more alarming ones. This first video takes place in Washington, D.C. on June 1st, when hundreds of demonstrators are gathered outside of the White House to protest the death of George Floyd.
Mounted police to clear what has been an entirely peaceful protest. Not 98%, not 99%, but 100% peaceful protest here today. There was no throwing of water bottles. There was no throwing of objects. You can see these officers aiming at the protesters who are here in the park as we're being cleared back along the sidewalk here in front of 8th Street. Again, hang on a second here. Ma'am, are you all right?
No, she's not all right, man.
I got him.
Now, at the exact same time, this was also happening to another news station.
We've just had to run about a block as police moved in. We've been fired at with rubber bullets. My cameraman has been hit. We've also seen tear gas being used. Here we go, they're moving through again. This is exactly what it looks like. Exactly what it looks like. We're just standing safely.
Oh. Whoa.
Amelia, can you hear us?
Amelia, are you okay? Or your cameraman? The police just charged at Amelia and our 7 News cameraman.
Which is interesting because they're not discriminating between protesters and the media here. Amelia, can you hear us yet?
Yes, I am. I am. You heard us yelling there that we were media, but they don't care. They are being indiscriminate at the moment.
Like Amelia states, these riot police are being indiscriminate towards everyone attending these protests. Not only the protesters themselves, but the media and even medical personnel are all being targeted. Now the next video I want to show you has to do with tear gas.
Oh shit.
This man approaches the police and is pepper sprayed. What happens next, you won't believe.
Fuck
He is shot in the head with a tear gas canister. How is this even justifiable? Now while we're talking about improperly fired tear gas canisters, this is Balin Brake, a 21-year-old college student who was protesting police brutality when he was struck in the face by a tear gas canister. He lost his eye. The next video I want to show you has a lot going on, but let me try and give you some context. This video was filmed on a CBS 46 Atlanta news camera. 21-year-old Tayana Pilgrim and 22-year-old Messiah Young left a Black Lives Matter protest 45 minutes after curfew had started. To start off, look at the bottom right corner of the video. A white woman waves at the camera, and just seconds later, police approach an African American couple in the car behind her. You can tell that no one in the car is resisting. You can see the shock and terror on their faces as to why multiple police officers are surrounding their car, trying to open their door, breaking their windows, slashing their tires, and tasing them. Tell me why 30 officers needed to have been watching the scene. Tell me why their windows needed to have been broken. Tell me why their tires needed to have been slashed. Tell me why they were tased and ripped out of their car. This isn't police brutality, this is blatant assault. 2 of the officers that tased Messiah and Tanaya were terminated, while 4 others were placed on administrative leave. Now these next videos I want to show you are even more enraging. In some cases, these riot police are taking away freedom of speech from those not committing a crime. Listen to what this man is saying. He's pleading to be understood.
I could have paid the white people. I could have paid the innocent cops. I could have paid. We're all scared. I am not your enemy. You are not my enemy. If you charge you and you charge us,
and what happens next?
Really
he is cherry-picked out of the crowd. For
Come
what?
on, what are you doing?
What are you doing?
Fuck you! What the fuck did you do?
Are you fucking kidding me?
What is that doing? What is he
This next video also shows a man being cherry-picked out of a crowd.
Prematurely shooting people? Prematurely using excessive force? Your scary ass on somewhere.
These police approach him, and when other protesters try to protect him, they are pepper sprayed. These police officers are violating the First Amendment right, and it's infuriating, because nothing can be done about it. That is how enraged these protesters feel. When police officers are assaulting their right to assemble, it shows again that they are a part of a larger system of racial inequality and abuse of power. Now, if your argument is I'm only focusing on the bad, well, then that's a lot of bad. In the past, many riots have started because of police brutality. Detroit 1967, Newark 1967, Harlem 1964, and Watts 1965. We are seeing the same thing now. History repeats itself. How much longer can we afford to repeat these same mistakes? Riots aren't the prerogative of these protesters, but when their rights are infringed upon, when they are peacefully protesting and they are pepper sprayed, what do you think is going to happen? In San Francisco, there was a zero-tolerance attitude about the 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew. Protesters who were resisting it were immediately subject to the use of force and arrested, but in Oakland, the police took a very different attitude. They believed as long as the protest remained peaceful, they were happy to facilitate it. So these Oakland police chose to preserve the peaceful character of these protesters rather than turn to tear gas and street fighting. And in Portland, there are scenes of unmarked, camouflaged, and heavily armed federal agents patrolling the streets and violently clashing with protesters. No names, no badges, with military uniforms not representing law enforcement at all.
They're acting like an uncontrolled mob on the street with uniforms and badges that they don't show. As you see right here, they beat this man up. Police don't do this. Watch this. What kind of bullshit is this?
There are no threats to public order if these protesters are not committing acts of violence. There should be no tolerance for police brutality, but once again, there is nothing we can do but protest. If you can't remove one bad apple from the bucket, the whole bucket goes bad. We must change our systems so that we can hold these cops accountable and be able to prosecute them for violating laws just like every other American citizen. We're living in a world where a spontaneous, decentralized protest cannot control every one of its protesters, hence the looters, and they are called thugs. But when a taxpayer-funded, heavily regimented workforce can't control all of its members, all they get is a slap on the wrist. Once again, violence isn't a prerogative of these protesters and looting is criminal, but don't place blame on an entire protest because of a couple of people. Don't confuse looters with the main movement of these peaceful activists to change and raise awareness to unjust policies and systems. Don't use this as an excuse to stop listening to the pleas of the vast majority.
America can write her name across this century, and so she will if we, the people, brown and black and red, rise now to the great occasion of our brotherhood. It will take courage. Giving the world back to its inhabitants is too big a job for the merely practical. No one of us will live to see a blameless peace. We strive and pray and die for what will be here when we're gone. Our children's children are the ancestors of a free people. The fight is worth it.
So what now? What can you do to change things? First off, don't stay silent. Don't let politicians talk for you. Let the changes you want to make be heard. I want police officers fired for witnessing crimes committed by other officers and not intervening. I want police officers to be held accountable for their unlawful actions and not just fired. I want qualified immunity abolished. I want 1/5 of a police officer's time to go to training for how to react in any situation and de-escalate violence before it happens. Police should be completely unbiased when it comes to sexuality, race, religion, and gender. I want police reform, but not in a broken system. Rethink long sentences for drug offenders, end money bail that disproportionately affects people in poverty, redirect public spending for smarter infrastructures like community-based drug treatments. I want reforms that reduce the number of people incarcerated for ethnic and racial disparities. Turn probation into something that supports and rewards success rather than detecting mistakes. Educate the young about our past, about the mistakes we made. Don't just teach a filtered down version of history. What about the future then? If every single grade school child is taught the explicit reality of what slavery and Jim Crow were really like, what people of color had to endure for so long, that generation will grow up and make a change. I guarantee it. We must now train key decision makers in the criminal justice system to recognize their bias. We must rebuild our systems into something that respects all human beings as an individual first and foremost. We must become truly aware and see all perspectives and sides to gain empathy, compassion, and tolerance. Come together, not apart, and work together to make change. Also, if you have not already, vote. If you already have, amazing. If you haven't, do it. Now, before I end this video, I want to mention something that's happened in recent months. John Lewis, an American politician and civil rights leader, passed away on July 17th. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1987 until his death, and is one of the early freedom fighters and civil rights leaders. What we're fighting for now is what he has been fighting for his entire life. The Black Lives Matter movement is a continuation of the civil rights movement. So continue the fight and stand up for equality. I'll end with a quote by Maya Angelou. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again.
Of these victims, I want you just to raise your voice and say Black Lives Matter. Tamia Horsford, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Robert Miller, Jamarion Robinson. Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter! We thank you for each and every life that is here with us, and we take tonight to honor and remember those who are no longer with us. We ask that you give us strength. We ask that you would continue to be with us as we come together as we have real courageous conversation, and as we provoke change in our community.
They say that free